All right, everybody. Welcome to our last seminar in this Global Existential Challenges series that we've organized this year. My name is Deborah Yashar. I'm the director of Pierce and also professor in the politics department and in SPIA. And I have to say, this has been such a fun series this year to bring together faculty from across the university, from different departments to talk about big issues. And so it's been delightful all year long, and it's wonderful to have this last seminar focused on the arts of domination and resistance. Before I say just a couple of words about the panel and introduce our speakers, even though they're not in the room, I really want to thank the people who helped to make this possible. Rachel Golden has been in the background of organizing everything, and Carol and Nikki, who are in the back, who've also helped out regularly throughout the year. So I just want to start off by, even if they're not in the room, maybe they'll hear, applauding them for all the work that they've done. All right, so for this last seminar series, we have yet another capacious title called The Art or Arts of Domination and Resistance. It's self-consciously ambiguous about what that actually entails. And as I was thinking about this panel, there were a couple of things that were on my mind, although I left it open for the speakers. One is when we think about the art or the arts, especially from the social sciences, we oftentimes think about it as the craft or strategy of doing something. And in this context, the craft and strategy, imagination for good or for ill, of producing domination and resistance. So oftentimes people think about power politics and social movements and things of this sort. So too, you might think about the art or arts as the production of art, broadly defined, in the context of producing domination and resistance. And so one of the things we might want to think about is really, are these even separable? The art of craft making to create power in the power politics social movements literature, and the art of producing domination and resistance through the very production of art broadly defined. So are these separable? How do they compare? How do they translate, a word that will come back as I introduce the speakers, and how do they change across context? So obviously we're not going to touch on all of these questions today, or maybe better said, maybe we will touch on all of them, but we will not answer them all today. But we are so delighted to have a wonderful set of speakers to help us to deliberate these issues. They each have about 12 minutes or so to speak, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, and they'll join us here at the start. So as I think about these speakers, each of them could take an hour and a half to introduce. They're terrific, a wonderful group of faculty, both as scholars and as teachers. And I want to highlight how diverse they are as they approach this question. They've come from, sometimes jointly, Comp Lit, Art and Archaeology, African American Studies, Anthropology and History. They work on different geographies, Europe, Africa, the Americas, and the Middle East. But they are all award-winning authors of books and articles addressing the themes of this panel. And they have been, again, as I've noted, excellent teachers and mentors to many of us here. So let me say just a few words about the speakers, and then let's get to it. First, we'll have Karen Emmerich. She's an associate professor of comparative literature and the director of the program in translation and intercultural communication here at Pierce. Her recent book, Literary Translation and the Making of Originals, brings recent work in the field of textual scholarship to bear in discussions of translation and vice versa by examining the interaction of translation and textual instability. And her current research explores the ways in which Greek citizenship and the Greek literary canon are constructed through parallel modes of targeted inclusion and expansive exclusion. And this is the focus of her current book. She's published many articles on the visual material poetics of Greek poets, and she is, moreover, a translator herself of modern and contemporary Greek literature. She will be followed then, and by the way, this will be in alphabetical order, by Chika Okeke-Agulu, who's a professor of art and archaeology and African American studies and the director of the program in African studies and the director of the new Africa World Initiative, again with strong ties to Pierce. He is an artist, a critic, an art historian, and he specializes in indigenous, modern, and contemporary African and African diasporic art history and theory. He has written many articles and books. I'm not going to name them all. I counted at least 5 books, but I'll note most recently, Elanatsui. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Yeah. The Reinvention of Sculpture in 2022, and African Artists from 1882 to now in 2021, as well as many others. He is, in addition, a curator, and perhaps some of you had the opportunity to see the recent exhibit, Samuel Fosso, Affirmative Actions, that was on Hullfish. It was a spectacular exhibit, along with others. And we are particularly grateful that he's here today because he's actually on sabbatical and has chosen to join us for this conversation. Next up will be Laurence Ralph. He is a professor of anthropology and the director of the Center on Transnational Policing. And he too has published many articles and books, this time related to violence, policing, and its implications. Here, let me just highlight his 2014 book, Renegade Dreams, Living Through Injury in Gangland Chicago, where he interrogates the consequences of the war on drugs, together with mass incarceration, the ramifications of heroin trafficking for HIV-infected teenagers, the perils of gunshot violence, and I could go on, but it's a really powerful book. And the latest book that he'll be speaking about today is entitled Torture Letters, Reckoning with Police Violence, which explores a decades-long scandal in which 125 were tortured while in police custody. Last will be Max Weiss, and I promise I'll tell you again why I put these four together who seem so divergent in terms of the foci of their work. Max Weiss is an associate professor of history and associate faculty in comparative literature. He studies the cultural, intellectual, and literary history of the modern Middle East, and he is the author of Revolutions, Aesthetics, A Cultural History of Ba'athist Syria, that came out in 2022, and also The Shadow of Sectarianism, Law, Shi'ism, and the Making of Modern Lebanon, which came out in 2020, both of which will be translated within the next period of time, soon, although I'm not sure of the exact time frame. He is, moreover, himself also a translator, most recently of Alawiya Saab's The Thing Called Love, that came out in 2022, amongst others. And in the past, he's also had a very active presence here at Pierce's Undergraduate Fellows Program. All right, so let me just reiterate. We have four fantastic speakers who are quite divergent in terms of their disciplinary and also their geographical region, but in different ways, they are all getting us to think about this intersection of art or arts, domination and resistance in different ways. And so let's get to it. Each of them will have about 12 minutes, and then, as I said, we'll open up for discussion. So let's give a warm welcome, and let's start with Karen Emmerich.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for the invitation to be part of this event. Thank you all for being here. Thanks also in advance to my fellow panelists for what I think is going to be a really wonderful conversation. So I have a text which I'm going to read, otherwise I would have gone over. Today's theme is the arts of domination and resistance, and it's a very broad theme, as Deborah pointed out. In a way, it feels like all art could be understood as falling into one of these two categories, and sometimes both at once, or both at different times or in different places. And it's precisely this mutability and the role of different actors in shaping how a work of art or literature is understood, how it functions, the work it does on a cultural and political level that I wanted to bring to the table today, particularly as regards the transnational movement of literature in translated or transcreated forms. I also wanted to fold into this conversation, and I know Max will be doing something similar later on, my role as a translator of Greek language literature, in part to stage another, if minor, act of resistance to the dominant discourse that we find in academic settings in the US, which tend to sideline the intellectual labor of translation, even as translation helps fuel almost every academic discipline, certainly those represented by our speakers, all of us speaking here today. So I'm going to take you very quickly through a few examples of what I see as the extremely complicated relationship between literary translation and forces of domination and resistance. Examples drawn from my own experience as a translator, an educator, and an advocate for Greek literature on a largely Anglophone international stage, a role that brings with it all the known complications of advocacy writ large, of speaking for linguistically minoritized writers in an English-dominant sphere. Power dynamics between languages is almost always a central element of the context in which any given translator works. And while translation can certainly be used as a tool of resistance, offering routes of access to marginalized writers and communities, telling stories that run counter to dominant historical cultural narratives, Even translations created in the spirit of resistance can easily fall into patterns of reception that use them to bolster the very narratives they seek to counter. And this, I think, also echoes something that Deborah had said in her introduction. This is to say nothing, of course, of translations actively created in the service of cultural narratives that seek to dominate and oppress. For instance, the kinds of translations Said writes about so eloquently as part of the philological apparatus of domination that were part and parcel of Orientalist thought. So let me take you briefly through how this plays out in my own work vis-a-vis the modern Greek literary tradition. First, some background. The history of modern Greek literature, certainly in the 20th and 21st centuries, is a history of literatures of both domination and resistance. Literatures written, say, in the context of the Greek state's ambitions to both expand and homogenize by expunging unwanted populations, which played out in the Balkan Wars, in the failed Asia Minor campaign, and in the subsequent exchange of populations that constituted a massive, internationally sanctioned action of ethnic cleansing for Greece and Turkey both. There are also texts that explicitly or implicitly work in opposition to a number of historical moments of oppression, including the dictatorship of General Ioannis Metaxas from 1936 to 1941, the Axis occupation of Greece from 1941 to 1945, the Civil War of 1946 to 1949, that was a really bad couple of decades, and the subsequent systematic repression of the losing communist side that resulted in upwards of 10% of the population of Greece being incarcerated in islands of exile, which could otherwise be described as re-education camps where torture was a common practice. And of course, the junta of 1967 to 1974, in which many of those camps were reopened. Throughout the remarkably unstable 20th century, writers both in Greece and living abroad in situations of exile wrote to resist, in languages including but not limited to Greek, and they shared their work where and how they could. With the stabilization of democratic rule in Greece in the late 1970s and then the entrance into the EEC and later the EU, Greek writers suddenly began writing much more about things that weren't explicitly political in nature, which itself is perhaps a kind of politics. And then with the sovereign debt crisis in 2012, we entered another era of writing to resist, this time the forces of global capital and Western domination that had made that window of supposedly non-political cultural products possible in the first place. This is a very schematic capsule description of fast-forward literary history that leaves out all kinds of things. Perhaps most importantly, the very thorny issue, thorny to me, not necessarily to the Greek literary or academic establishment, of who counts as a Greek writer to begin with, and the ways in which the most common stories told about modern Greek literature have left out all kinds of people who wrote, say, in minoritized languages spoken within the Greek state, or in non-standard forms of Greek, or in unrecognizable language script combinations, the Karamanlides who wrote Turkish and Greek script, or the Muslims of Yanina who wrote Greek and Arabic script, and so on. Seen in this light, even a literary history that focuses on the resistant power of Greek literary and other cultural production runs the risk of becoming, in fact, a history of majoritarian domination over other minoritized cultural products and producers. So what happens to these kinds of questions when you move into the realm of translation, and particularly translation into a globally dominant language like English? First of all, as Shimishi writes, when literature crosses national boundaries, culturalization comes into full play. In the Greek to English context, one thing that happens is that even my fast-forward literary history usually comes as news to 99.9% of potential readers for any given book, since even the field of Greek literature has to be modified as modern Greek literature, since the Greeks people care about tend to be the ones that have been dead for at least 2,200 years. And the reading of anything you might have to offer will likely be shaped by expectations of influence and continuity that are also bound up in incredibly problematic racialized understanding of Greekness. My work as both an educator and a translator has always tried to tell the story of Greek literature differently, to offer other stories, other narratives, and to impact broader understandings of the relationship between the literary and the political. This doesn't always mean, though, translating explicitly political work. Early in my career as a translator, I noticed that publishers only ever asked me to translate the works of men, and that there were extremely few Greek women writers whose work was still in print in English, if it ever had been. And so I decided to translate only women for a while, and women whose work was experimental or differently challenging or fell outside the kinds of stories that were already available to Anglophone readers. When I was asked to do a book by Yanis Ritsos, communist writer, winner of the Lenin Prize, who spent years in internment camps and house arrest, I was surprised to find that most of the material available in English presented not his explicitly political poems, but either his short, imagistic, quasi-surrealist work or his long monologues attributed to figures from Greek mythology. So I don't have slides, I have books. I chose to translate instead 3 short collections he wrote while exiled in a series of re-education camps. You can also see that these are teaching copies, so they do, like the intersection of pedagogy and translation is also really important to me. The 3 short collections he wrote while exiled in a series of re-education camps in the 1940s, so that there would be a record in English of this experience. Then when the sovereign debt crisis hit in 2012 and Greece and Greeks were being routinely castigated and humiliated in the international press, often in ways that involved bizarre comparisons to their lofty ancestors, purely out of annoyance, I designed a class called Beyond Crisis, for which I then translated a contemporary novel and a book of short stories and circulated them as PDFs to my students so that they could have other images of Greece and precarity, domination and resistance written from within. At the time, I felt like I was making a difference, but it turns out to be more of a cautionary tale than that, as you'll see. So one of the books that I translated for that course was Something Will Happen, You'll See by Christos Ikonomou. It's an amazing book of short stories about precarity and poverty in working class parts of Athens and Piraeus that are coded in the Greek imagination as refugee neighborhoods where families settled who were forcibly displaced by the Greek-Turkish population exchange of 1922. The book itself presents several moments of protest. A young man standing in front of a building site where his best friend died because of workplace negligence, holding an empty sign since he can't find the words for his loss or pain or complaint. A young couple gluing their hands together so the man, an undocumented resident of Athens, won't be deported, and many others. It's an incredible book and deeply pessimistic about the efficacy of political protest in a neoliberal state, as is Ikonomou's next book. Sorry, I couldn't find the English. Good Will Come from the Sea, Το καλό θα έρθει από τη θάλασσα, in which the idealistic would-be entrepreneurs of socially minded cooperative ventures, all of them internal economic migrants, are targeted by local mafias and police, have their bodies broken, find their establishments burned to the ground, and so on. If I've ever made a positive difference in anyone's life, I feel it might be in Ikonomou's. The publisher I first approached with his work has ended up signing all of his books, sight unseen, after that first one. He gets widely reviewed, and these 2 translations were the basis for him winning the inaugural Chattery Prize for International Literature last year, which came with a big chunk of change that was really meaningful to him. I'm thrilled for Christos, who is truly an incredible writer, but this is also a story of what Shimishi has also called technologies of recognition, by which writers from elsewhere can be made legible to Anglophone, and particularly American and British audiences. Ikonomou is described in almost every review, from the New York Times to LARB to every review on Goodreads and Amazon, like everywhere, as a bard of the Greek crisis or some version of that. Of course, not always in those words. And this packaging becomes a form of literary disaster tourism that in fact doesn't really resist, but can be made to fully align with the very narratives of crisis that I was trying to counteract by translating them to begin with. As for the course that I designed in part around this book, it was a course in which we discuss things like the rise of neo-Nazi ideologies in Greece, the murders of activist and artist Pavlos Fyssas, an anti-racist rapper, and Zach Kostopoulos, a queer rights activist and drag performer, and so on and so forth. The first time I taught that class in a large lecture hall at the University of Oregon, teaching largely from a position of rage against various machines, what my students seemed to come away with was generally a feeling that Greece was an effed up place, direct quote from one of my students, and that they were all so lucky not to be living there. This was deeply distressing to me, as I'm sure you can imagine, but was also an important object lesson in the strength of these technologies of recognition that have been operative from the days of outright Orientalism on down. The difficulty of intervening in those narratives and the dangers of, in fact, replicating them, even in those moments when we're trying actively to shift the needle on those representations. There's so many more things that I could say, but I know it's important that I stick to time, so I'm just gonna stop there and hope that we can continue in the Q&A. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Deborah, for putting this together and for bringing the four of us together in this panel, of which I'm quite excited about. You raised a question at the beginning about this question of art, whether it's the craft, right, of administering domination or resistance, or expressive productions or manifestations of that. And I think that, as you also pointed out, that those two go hand in hand, in the sense that if one, I'm a firm believer that art is politics by other means. And okay, thank you. And I see the expressive forms or expressive manifestations of domination and resistance as basically what they are, that they're expressing an ideology or a philosophy or a political position for domination or against domination. And what I want to do today is to just look at a specific case study. For that then allows us to think broadly about how these histories and processes manifest in other parts of the world, in the United States, for instance, or in Europe or Asia. And I'm specifically interested in South Africa. The colonial history of the African continent and the way that it manifested in South Africa. And then the next part, and this is where we're talking about domination, imperial colonial domination. And we're also looking at another case study within South Africa, which has to do with the expressive forms, right, of the domination and the resistances that were arrayed against that. And that specifically is about apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement. And that, of course, intersects colonial domination and racial domination. And these are very important points and ways to think about domination. And what that then allows us, as I mentioned earlier, is that we can fairly easily identify global forms of domination, some more legible than others. And I think that it's in the less legible but no less profound forms of domination that acts of resistance become even as well less legible and less clear, precisely because the target is always shifting. And I think that's one of the things that we can also talk about. Like if you think about capitalism, right? We think we know what it is, but it manifests in many forms. And therefore, expressive forms against that also are hard to track, and to define what forms that they take. And so the first element, or the first part, is about this guy, Cecil Rhodes, who, of course, we all know one way or the other who Cecil Rhodes is, either with the Rhodes Scholarship for the Western international world, or for the Africans, especially the Southern Africans, who know him as one of the most rapacious of colonialists, who had this dream, right, of connecting the entire African continent into one imperial domain for Britain. And that was the whole point of his Cape to Cairo. He wanted to lay telegraphic line from Cape Town to Cairo. And the cartoon by Edward Sanborn from 1892 illustrates this colonial and imperial ambition that he had, straddling the entire continent, and with the telegraphic line, one linked to Cape Town on the map and the other to Cairo. And of course, he was such an influential imperialist. He was the quintessential colonial businessman, right? That captured the Southern African economy, the mining, the land appropriations, and what have you. So in the minds of the Southern Africans, you couldn't find a much more terrible dominator, right? A terrible expression and manifestation of everything that was wrong about imperialism than in this body, in this person of Cecil Rhodes. And so in 1934, the monument to Cecil Rhodes was created and installed in Cape Town. And on the pedestal is a poem by, perhaps the best known British imperial poet, Rudyard Kipling. Again, talking about this dream, right, of basically colonizing the entire African continent. And this statue stayed in that site until 2015, but we will come to that. And so this guy, this Cecil C. Rhodes, after he died, his person, his spirit, his idea and ideology was manifested, expressed in the sculpture. So the craft of imperialism was given form in this monumental portrait of Cecil C. Rhodes. And when I talk about portraits, we could take a leap to think about Mount Rushmore and what that means to Native Americans, the dominating the entire landscape, right? And so this piece was there, but it was made in 1934. Now, what was happening in South Africa in the 1930s was the consolidation of what became racial apartheid, when the British, who are weaker, were increasingly overpowered by the Afrikaners, who are Dutch-derived white South Africans. And they were coming together basically because the British, the Anglo-white South Africans, realized that they were increasingly being dominated, or rather overpowered, after several decades. And the manifestation of Afrikaner ideology became quite, loud in the 1930s. And so, whereas Cecil C. Rhodes was Anglophone, what did the Afrikaners do? They trumped them. It wasn't just about building, a statue for Cecil C. Rhodes. They built the Voortrekker Monument. And the Voortrekker Monument is supposed to memorialize the crossing of the ancestors of the Afrikaners in the 1830s from the coast into the hinterland. They were running away from the British imperial machine into the hinterland, where they then basically occupied the lands and peoples that they found there. And so this monument that they began to build in 1935 was to memorialize their domination of Black South Africans. And so this structure, which was modeled after some building in Germany from the 19th century, was built on a hill overlooking Pretoria. And so the structure itself dominated the landscape. There is no way, if you've been to Pretoria, that without looking up and seeing this massive structure up on the hill, and that's another view of it. Now, what is this? This is just a schematic, and what's important is that it's actually an amazing structure. It has an oculus at the top that allowed light to come from the sun, the sky, to a cenotaph at the bottom, 3 levels down. That's a cenotaph for you, South Africa. So the light will go on December 16, which was the day that they memorialized their triumph over the Zulu. And on December 16, light will come from the sun and strike the cenotaph. In other words, this was a mystical, event that even the cosmos approved. But guess what? Like every imperial ideology, it always almost fails. Because if you go to this same structure today, December 16, light will not strike the cenotaph. They didn't figure that time, places its own hold on our minds and our ideologies. The other thing to point out is there's a sculptural frieze around the base of this structure. At the time that this was made, it was the largest sculptural frieze on the planet. So the scale of the ambition to dominate the Black South Africans, and these are some of the details, basically telling the story of how they came to become the triumphant group in South Africa. And in 1949, yes, a year after apartheid became the official political system in South Africa after the 1948 elections, Voltreka Monument was inaugurated. And you see thousands and thousands of white Afrikaners that came to it. But so we're the sculpture and the architecture of domination, right? What happens in the 1980s, we began to see very tactical acts of resistance against both forms of domination, the political ideology of apartheid and the expressive forms of it. Arrayed against these were visual practices that were put in place. In 1982, South African artists came together to think about how to mount a resistance against apartheid in a conference at Gaborone outside of South Africa. And they came up with the idea of art as a weapon of the struggle. Now, I mentioned this because, as I said earlier, apartheid was very clear, as a racist imperial ideology. And so it was very easy to target, right, in terms of the forms of resistances against that. And so poster campaigns, international campaigns, marshaled against apartheid. And of course, in 1990, apartheid ended. And what happens to these expressive forms of domination? And there were debates in South Africa at the time whether to pull down the Voltreka Monument or to create a Boerastic Park, a pun on the Boers, who are the Afrikaners, where all the sculptures will be kept, a kind of Disney of apartheid. Just to get us to where we are today, the Voltreka Monument was not pulled down. It still remains there because they figured out different approaches to these forms of domination. The Voltreka Monument let it stand there as a testimony to the ambitions and vacuousness, really, of apartheid imperial ideology. Because you go there now, it's very few people actually go to say it. So it's almost an indictment on the very mindset that thought that this would be the place, where South Africans will come to worship at the feet of apartheid. In 2015, as we very well know, the Rhodes Must Fall movement began that anticipated the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and elsewhere. And this was arrayed against Cecil C. Rhodes because he was the expressive form of the domination that earlier manifested as apartheid, but which continued beyond apartheid, where it becomes the target is less easy to track. And so the monument came down, and finally, Setimbile Nsizane, one of the young South African artists, performed while this monument was being pulled down. And she called her performance Chapungu, which is a reference to the stone eagles that were found in Great Zimbabwe, the ruins after which modern-day Zimbabwe was named. And why this is important, just next few seconds, why this is important is that Cecil C. Rhodes was one of those who worked hard to prove that Great Zimbabwe was not built by Africans. Because it's such a massive structure, how could these Africans build such a thing, right? And he even took one of the stone eagles for his own keep. And so Setimbile wanted to remind us that there's a connection between Rhodes Must Fall and the imperial ideologies about denigrating African cultural histories and heritages by performing as a living, live Chapungu eagle. And so she, while the monument was being brought down, she dressed in this, constructed wing. And for 4 hours, she was standing with her hands up. It was such a crazy, demanding performance. But she did that, not just her own personal response to what was going on, but guess what? The bringing down of the monument did not get as much attention as her performance internationally. And this tells us how the arts can participate in arts of resistance against domination in ways that might be subtle, but profound. Thank you.
I just want to thank Deborah for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about my work. I think that my work is often, I think of it as very intentionally at the intersection of a dialectic between domination and resistance. Domination and resistance as concepts and categories constantly get undone and reformed in my work. One striking example is, I think my first book, which is on gang violence in Chicago. It centers on gang members who've been shot and disabled as a result of gun violence. And after I finished the book, I was sharing it with some community members, as I usually do, showing them the parts in the book where they were represented. At that time, I had just got a contract for the book from University of Chicago Press, and the title of the book was Half Dead. It was based on a comment that one of my interlocutors made. He said that living in this wheelchair, I feel like half of my body's dead, and the other half is in prison to this wheelchair, right? And so when I was showing the book around the community, people hated that title, right? They were saying, why do we have to be half dead? We're always half dead. People like you, as in researchers, anthropologists, sociologists, always describe our communities in this way. And I had to then think seriously about that, right? And so the other part of the half-dead sensibility, Justin, who was the interlocutor who came up with this, said that it was living through injury and dreaming despite injury. And so the book ended up being called Renegade Dream. to err on the side of how people live through injury rather than dwelling precisely on the injury itself, right? After I did that research on gang violence in Chicago, one thing that I didn't have the chance to really discuss was police violence. It was a prominent topic. Gang members are always criminalized. There was a heavy influence of policing in the neighborhood. But as I delved into the topic of police violence, I realized quickly that this was its own thing that would really, it was a whole nother book in itself, right? And part of how I came to that realization was a case of one particular young man, Aaron Harrison, who was running away from the police and was shot in the back. This is before Trayvon Martin, it's before Black Lives Matter. And the response in the community was that nothing is going to happen to the police officers. And when I asked, why do you think nothing's going to happen? This is actually caught on video, right? It was caught on the police department's own blue light camera that they used to surveil the neighborhood. And the response was that, well, if nothing happened to John Burge, nothing's going to happen to these officers. And that's when I started saying, well, who is John Burge? What is this? And John Burge is a police commander who worked in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, who had led a torture ring and who had tortured, at that point, more than 100 Black men while in police custody. And it was well known that he had done this, and civil cases had been going on for decades to hold Burge accountable. I became fascinated with this topic of police torture in Chicago, but I had to wait till I was finished with the Renegade Dream book to really delve into it. And I found that this was another clear instance of domination, state-sanctioned violence by the police department on its citizens. But how people thought about violence and how people thought about torture in particular shifted over time. When these cases first started in the 1980s, judges, a lot of lawyers didn't even believe that something like post-traumatic stress disorder existed. In the first case that was in 1981, the lawyers for Andrew Wilson, the man who accused the city of torture, tried to bring in an expert on post-traumatic stress disorder, and the judge didn't allow him to testify and said, I don't believe there is such a thing, right? And so how Wilson eventually gained recognition for his wounds was through a particular torture device that's called the black box. It's a hand-cranked machine that was connected to his body, and through electrical wires, the police officers, in this case John Burge, cranked the machine, and he was tortured in that way through electrocution, right? And this is very important because, in a way, the only way that we were able to see torture as torture is because of this machine. And this machine is one that Burge had learned to use while he was in Vietnam. It is a machine that was originally a field telephone that military officers used. And Burge had apparently used this machine in Vietnam and then brought a version of it back to Chicago. And so from that example, I learned a couple important things. One, that torture is often seen in light of what happens internationally. And oftentimes domestically, we don't recognize it as torture per se if without that referent, that international referent. And part of how we were able to eventually identify a community of torture survivors were through the marks on that machine, because again, torture was viewed as something that was only physical at first. So because Wilson had these strange marks, he was able to show that the machine that he described actually existed, and that nothing else could have given him these strange marks in police custody besides this machine. And after his testimony, other people in police custody had the same marks, came forward, and they were able to show that they were tortured in the same way. Eventually, the idea of torture and the definition of torture expanded, but that was through a lot of political activism. Deborah was telling me about your work in Latin America. A lot of that work was through Amnesty International in the 1990s, directly comparing it to what was happening in Latin America and saying that this is what Latin American dictators are doing, and the U.S. calls it torture. This is what Burge did, but we're not calling it torture. What's the difference, right? And so that initiated the first wave of civil suits regarding police torture. Another wave came after 9/11, when the U.S. was accused of torturing people in the war on terror. The Abu Ghraib scandal initiated another wave of civil suits. The controversy on Guantanamo Bay initiated another wave of civil suits. And so you can see that there is a correlation between when these civil suits are happening in Chicago and the prevalence of them and what is being discussed internationally as a definition of torture is getting expanded and refined. And so for this work, I was a researcher working as part of a wider social movement which emerged to gain recognition for the category of torture and to say that there is a thing called torture and it happens in the U.S. and these people in police custody have experienced this, right? So at first it was just to say that torture existed. Eventually that social movement merged and transformed and morphed to gain recognition or gain some type of settlement for the torture survivors. And so here's where we come to the idea of resistance, I think, and which for anthropologists is often a fraught term. We've often been accused of romanticizing resistance and making it seem that anything is resistance. And so the controversy over resistance often hinges on intentionality and motivation, which is to say that how do the people themselves, what do they think that they are doing, right? What are their motivations for doing it? And how is there any way that we can measure success, right? And so there's some problems with that kind of strict definition of resistance, but in this case, it's important because it's actually useful for understanding how we get reparative justice in these torture cases. So the collective efforts culminated in 2015 in a reparations ordinance in which the city of Chicago gave legal settlements to the torture survivors. They also gave access to education for the torture survivors and their families. And they also created a torture justice center where anybody in Chicago who has experienced police violence can get counseling. And they also created a mandate that the history of the torture cases be taught in Chicago public schools. And so as part of my research, I've been contributing to that curriculum, which also gets to the question of craft. I knew that the work that I was doing, the book that I was writing, could not contribute to the curriculum in the way that I would like, because the curriculum is geared towards the 8th and 10th grade students in Chicago. And so I created an animated film that deals with the topics of police violence. And I specifically use the form of animation, the craft of animation, to get at this dialectic between domination and resistance. In the film, a lot of the descriptions of torture are not literal, but they're emotional. And the emotional register that I try to access comes from forms being rigid and hard, and then breaking apart and morphing into different forms to represent the capacity to transform. And so I think that when we think about this dialectic, we always have to think about the work of domination, how it works on not just the physical level, but the symbolic level, as the previous presentation showed so well, but also the work of resistance in helping to transform and break apart domination and create something new. And it is in that intersection of creating something new, of imagining different forms and different possibilities that I situate my work, and that I feel that the work of reparative justice, transformative justice is done. So, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Deborah for the kind invitation. Listening to my three extremely brilliant colleagues is both humbling and exciting. I also have already noticed some ways in which what seemed to me initially to be a fairly disparate, Deborah said divergent, collection of scholars and interests did manage to overlap with each other, and I think overlap with what I'm going to talk about now, which is now made, I think, a little bit more flexible by virtue of something that Deborah said in her initial remarks, namely thinking about art and arts in the plural of domination and resistance. And so I find it very interesting to think about art in terms of creative expression, which will be primarily what I talk about in the first bit here of a piece with what Chika was speaking about. And then secondly, to think about the art of resistance, specifically with respect to what Deborah started to speak about, the political art of resistance. And I might add here, the rhetorical art of resistance as well. So what I'd like to do in the time I have is to begin under the sign of domination through reference to a book that I published last year. It's very pleasurable and indulgent of me to carry this book around. If there is a statute of limitations on that, I don't think I've reached it yet. So this is a historical study of aesthetics, politics, and cultural production in Ba'athist Syria. That is to say, from 1970, with the arrival of Hafiz al-Assad and his supporters to power in a November of 1970 coup, also known euphemistically, you might say, as a corrective movement. And I track the overlapping cultural and intellectual fields as they are structured and restructured by this emergent regime as it consolidated its power and its authority. The argument then looks at the cultural politics of domination through a very specific lens, through the genres, through the fields of literature and cinema. And I explore questions of power, ideology, but also aesthetic form through close readings, primarily of novels with respect to the literary realm, feature films, and a handful of documentaries with respect to cinema, but also the structure and function of cultural periodicals, specifically those that deal with literature, film, and to a certain extent, other matters of aesthetic criticism, of the practice of writing and filmmaking in technical terms as well. The way that I look at the forms of cultural domination that are embedded in these materials is to think about the project of state making under the what I call the Assadist Ba'athist regime, to distinguish the significance of Assadism, which is to say the role of Hafiz al-Assad himself, as well as his family and his supporters, and to distinguish Assadism from Ba'athism, which is a theory and a practice of Arab nationalism cultivated in the 1930s by a series of Syrian intellectuals, which, as many of you will know, then spread into neighboring countries as well, and serving as the foundation for the establishment of new political regimes in Iraq as well, although there were Ba'athist cells and intellectuals around the Arabic-speaking world, from the Maghreb and North Africa all the way to Iraq. And so I can say more about the role of Assadism itself, which is a conceptual category and indeed a political force that has not received adequate theorization in my own field of Middle East studies. And so I'm happy to say more about that. But in order to express what I'm trying to say about the arts of domination under the Assadist Ba'athist regime, I employ a term, not one that was used all that often by Syrian intellectuals or bureaucrats and political commissars who spoke in the name of this incipient regime, a term which I use, that is Ba'athist cultural revolution. So adapting a term that is familiar from other historical contexts. Of course, China would be the first one to come to mind, but I argue that there is a cultural dimension to what political scientist Raymond Hinnebusch calls the revolution from above that the Syrian regime embarked upon from the 1970s and onward. So in a sense, that is kind of like the broad framing of the book, but in more fine detail, the argument seeks to disentangle the various artistic forms that are generated by both state-allied and indeed state-backed agents, as well as individuals and collectivities that sought to articulate different aesthetic forms in the face of and alongside the Ba'athist regime. And in order to look at these, I adapted terms that I will just present for the purposes of discussion. I identified an aesthetics of power that is primarily identified with the Syrian regime and its attempts to capture, its incomplete and ultimately failed attempts to capture the cultural and intellectual fields. Now, I'm going to build on something that Laurence said, which I think is crucially important in terms of, if I may, disrupting the binary that Deborah has laid out for us between domination and resistance. So whereas it's quite significant and important to identify what I think I do in the book as aesthetics of resistance, namely specific and targeted opposition to state policy and practice, excuse me, I prefer to see the various forms of resistance under two different rubrics, that of the aesthetics of resistance and what I call the aesthetics of solidarity. And the difference, as I see it, is that an aesthetics of solidarity permits a cultural producer to not necessarily position their work in strict opposition to the regime per se, but may seek to develop new aesthetic forms, new ways of writing, new ways of filmmaking, new ways of discussing the place of culture in Syrian life more generally that would build community from the ground up. And so these are sort of the overarching principles that I tried to work with in the book. Limited time here, I'm happy to talk more about it, but I am, happy to talk more about that. Let me stop there and shift now, if I may, a bit abruptly, to talk about a different way in which I am currently engaged with thinking through the arts of resistance in the Syrian context. Now, what I didn't tell you about the book is its historical dimension. The book looks at three phases in the history of modern and contemporary Syria. That is the period of Hafiz al-Assad's rule from 1970 until his death in the summer of 2000, the first decade or so of his son Bashar al-Assad, who came to power in the wake of Hafiz's passing, as a second period. And then third, I look at the period of the Syrian Revolution and the subsequent Syria war. Also can talk more about all of this with anyone who would like at another time. In thinking through the conceptual and analytical categories that I've elaborated from the book, I must say that I owe a dark debt of gratitude to my reading of and translation of Syrian writers, both fiction and nonfiction. I salute Karen in her tireless efforts to promote not only the work of translation itself, but especially the point she made today about the significance of academic translation, nonfiction translation generally, but more specifically, the work of intellectuals from around the world. In this case, I'll talk about Syria. There are ongoing and active debates within the Syrian intellectual field, both inside of Syria and diasporically, that deal with some of the most burning questions that I have already described in terms of the historical study that I have recently finished. One of the most painful but also crucial discussions that have gone on prior to 2011 about torture, about state violence, about repression, and about the role of the soi-disant revolutionary Syrian regime exploded from 2011 and after. These were then debates that could be had in public in ways that they hadn't been previously. Now, tragically, this happened to coincide with the utter disintegration and collapse of Syria as a nation state, problem we are still confronting, problem to which I have no solutions to offer. And every time I give a talk such as this, I feel impelled to point out that whatever aesthetic and intellectual considerations I am submitting for your discussion and our discussion pale in comparison to the scope of the human tragedy that continues to beset the Syrian people and those who care about their fate and future. Since I am already running out of time, Yassin al-Hajj Saleh is perhaps the best known and most influential Syrian intellectual. He was born in 1961 in Raqqa in eastern Syria. He left the country in 2013 and has been in exile ever since, currently resides in Berlin. In addition to being a communist activist, he was imprisoned, tortured in Syrian prisons, especially in the notorious Tadmor or Palmyra prison, desert prison, for upwards of 22 years. In 2021, Yassin published a book, which in crude literal translation is Atrocity and Representation, Reflections on a Decimated Syria and the Impossibility of Reconstruction. I am currently translating that book into Arabic, and I promise it will have a better title when it comes out in English. The book is a searing and painful meditation on the specific experience that Yassin and his comrades endured, that is to say, the experience of Syrian state violence, followed by an analysis of the horror of the Syria war, and the difficulty raised, and this is a universal problem, of course, and I'll try to say something about that, of representing atrocity and mass violence. So the book sets up a comparison between the Syrian case, and the case means both pre-revolutionary and during the time of the war, and sets the Syrian case against the experiences of, respectively, the Nazi Holocaust and the Stalinist regime. What Yassin does in this book, and this is something that I think also intersects with what Laurence has been talking about, is to wrestle with the ethics of representation in a time of mass atrocity. So to take one specific example, and this is where I can end, Yassin has engaged in a debate with his fellow Syrian intellectual, who is also a filmmaker, named Ali Atasi, about the ethics of circulating and indeed viewing at all grisly images of mangled bodies, torture victims, other crimes against humanity. Yassin's argument is that there is an imperative to look, to put this all very crudely. And Yassin insists that there is a political, I guess I can just say it, art of resistance that he is putting forward as an appropriate response to atrocity. So Yassin, in some ways, is also expanding our conception of resistance here in the sense that one of Yassin's main projects from his earliest politicization was, of course, to challenge the authority and the power of the Hafez al-Assadist regime and after. And so resistance is extremely political for Yassin. But something else that he points out in this book, which I find particularly useful, which is why I brought up the idea of a rhetorical art of resistance, is his argument that there is a resistance to representation on the part of those who would argue against the ethical imperative to look or to represent or to portray atrocious, adapting the term, imagery. And this debate, I think, this is where I can end, I think is one of the possible additions that the work of a metropolitan scholar who is non-Syrian like myself can achieve. And so the hope is that when this book gets published in English, it will not only be Yassin's text, but it will also include the back and forth that he had with Ali Attasi in the online Syrian journal, Al-Jumhuriyya, which Yassin helped to co-found in 2012. So summing up, seems to me that the arts of domination and resistance in the Syrian context, at least, are political, ideological, also rhetorical. And they operate at multiple scales, from the frame of a global system of military conflict, ongoing proxy war inside of Syria, down to the level of the state and its project of attempting to capture the cultural field and promote a specific, what I've called an aesthetics of power, and all the way down to the individual experience of horror and atrocity, and indeed what an ethical response ought to be. And I think the virtue of Yassin's argument is that his imperative to look, regardless of whether we agree or not, is a question, is a provocation that does not only apply to Syrians, but to all of us. Thank you.
So thank you. This is all new to me, so my questions may be completely uninformed. But I was curious about the fact of, in terms of domination, and Max mentioned as this idea of binaries, there's also a sense of just how dominant is that domination. It's not as if you're either in a situation of dominance or there's not dominance. And so I was wondering about what's underlying how you think about the system, what actually constitutes domination, and the degrees of domination that allow certain kinds of art to be practiced and other kinds of art to not to be practiced. Because the space and privilege that allows certain kinds of art of whatever kind to manifest itself requires a set of processes, capacities, resources, audiences for whom you're doing this. And so one question is, what is in your mind when you think, you showed the great picture of Cecil Rhodes and so on. The self-image is great, but those people, that's how they saw themselves in Rhodes. But so there's a set of presumptions about just how dominant do you think your domination actually is? And in that, there's a question of both domination over time. Right? Do you think you're going to be dominant forever? Is that what the time scale on which you're building and representing? Or is it, what's the nature of the domination that you're actually talking about? Are we talking about the same idea of domination in all of these cases in terms of the requirements for domination and the time over which dominance is to exist? And the same for resistance. Resistance is a privilege. Most people in systems of domination, as Jim Scott taught us, accommodate to avoid all the pain that domination can bring to you. So he talks about accommodation, subservience, and just getting along, be quiet, etc. Dissimulate. So where are the privileges of resistance? How long do you think you'll have those privileges if you keep resisting? And so it was just the underlying behind the picture that I was kind of trying to get at, because I thought the presentations were all great.
I'm wondering about the ethics of representation in the context of mass violence for the whole panel, if they could weigh in, and the imperative to look in terms of comparative media, because putting trauma on screen, the moving image is often over the top. If it's a painting, it's maybe not quite as in your face. If it's in writing, it's quite different still. And so I was wondering if you could explore that concept of comparative media and representing mass violence.
Thank you so much for incredibly thought-provoking, moving presentations. I was thinking about an expression, Karen, that you used, academic domination, or at least I heard it that way, and I heard it throughout as well. So I just wonder, where do you see dents today or resistances within or through academic domination?
So two quick things. The question about the nature and scales of domination, right? That you raised, types. I think the underlying assumption is that domination is a result of power differential, and within that implies different scales of power, right? Some are less perceptible than others. Some are powerful but less legible. And this is really what I was trying to raise, that certain forms of domination are so endemic that we don't see them. That's why, gender domination was has such a long history, because we take that for granted. There are systems that naturalize these forms of domination, racial domination, right? And in that sense, the forms of resistance against those take time to form because of the power of the systems that support and entrench those forms of domination. And that takes much more radical action to get out of that stupor, right, of being dominated, of accepting your status and state. And we've seen this in American history, right, where it had to take folks from the north, to go south and then be called names for coming to stir up, what is supposed to be a system that works, right? We've seen that, right, as part of American history. So we can always pick and choose which types of domination, depending on our work, depending on our fields, depending on our own intellectual and political affiliations. The question about representation, I think, is very important. We remember the act of Emmett Till's mother to display the mangled body of her son. That was such a radical political decision that she made. And so representation of tortured bodies can be an act of domination. That's why, when we kill our enemies, we drag them out in the streets to show that we've done that, take their heads or something else. But in terms of why the dominated might want their mangled bodies to be seen, that in itself is a political act. Susan Sontag had a book, some years back, on the pain of others, right? And which is about how we, the collective Western, we represent the bodies of others, the tortured bodies of others, which are okay, but not our own bodies. We don't want to see our war dead. But, everybody else is fine to see. And this one last comment, maybe there's something also animalistic about that. Animals tend to avoid their own dead. Maybe that's where this sensibility has come out of, in spite of civilization that we then think we have.
Okay. Thanks. I'll address this question about how you represent violence. I think what I struggle with the most in writing about torture is like how to write about torture. And I think my book is as much about that as anything else. Ultimately, it's called Torture Letters because I wrote it as letters to various constituencies. And I felt that ethically there was no way I had to pick an audience and tell them precisely what they needed to know about these tortured circumstances in order to circumscribe what I was conveying. I think when you I think part of the voyeurism is when anybody can see everything, and therefore people are reading it in different ways and taking the image and the representation in ways that are unintended. But for me, when I looked at the torture survivors in Chicago, what they were doing didn't seem voyeuristic, because if they were talking about the marks on their bodies, it was because they needed to talk about it in evidence in a court case. But when they were talking to community groups, they didn't talk about the marks on their bodies. They talked about other aspects of the torture, right? And so I think the question of representation is crucially tied to the question of audience. And why are we talking about this to particular audiences is at the heart of that.
I hope Karen will answer Joao's question, because I'm really interested in it, but I also think I'm going to respond to the question about ethics of representation, because it does seem so central to at least what I'm thinking about on a very regular basis in terms of the situation in and around Syria. And I think something Chika said has spurred how I'd like to respond, which is the question of the subject in view, on display, under consideration. So the we that I am encountering as translator is a Syrian we. And the debate within the Syrian intellectual field is one around whether our bodies ought to be displayed. And the display is a global display. So the key moments in the history of this conversation that I've just related a little bit about between Yassin and Alia and others revolves around a couple of moments, namely a specific Syrian film called Silvered Water, Syria Self-Portrait, 2014, by the filmmaker Osama Muhammad, in which a young boy is shown being sodomized by a truncheon wielded by a regime security agent. It only takes up something like a minute of the 100 minutes film, but it created such a stir among Syrian intellectuals. Something could talk about. The second is the Caesar report and the display of thousands of photographs that were leaked by a Syrian regime insider, but circulated and displayed in the halls of the US Congress. And so for many Syrians, this was an opportunity. It felt like the opportunity to have the cause that they were struggling for this was 2017, I guess, for 6 years. But the issue there was precisely what I was just saying I learned a bit from Chika to think with, namely that this was a violation of some imagined cultural sovereignty over Syrian bodies. And so much as I think Laurence is saying that certain bodies matter more and less even within the United States, when the US is functioning within this global sphere of visuality, things get a little bit more complicated. So who has the right to speak, who has the right to determine what is seen and what is not seen may be beyond a personal choice. It might actually be structured by systems of power like the US Congress, for example.
Okay, I know we have to vacate, so I will just say very quickly, I will answer that question. And I think Max also has answered the question in a sense in his representation of what he is doing, right, in translating Yassin's book. And I think one of the things that it is like a big passion of mine is the issue of language justice in the an English dominant academic sphere that we're all working in, right? And that one of the things that we can do thinking of ethics of representation in a really different way is translate the work of our colleagues who are working elsewhere, who are having these conversations that are so central, but also grounded in really different kinds of, conversations and sort of embedded in a place that most of our students and colleagues in other fields, whatever it is, that don't have access to, right? So the sort of the channels of access are really important to me, especially working in a sphere in which, so many of the people whose work I admire, I'm like here at Princeton with an amazing library, and they are like unemployed and don't have access to JSTOR, and that feels not right to me. And I think it's really different. And then you have people who you're translating who are living in, situations where they don't have access to a home community that doesn't exist anymore. So I think that's something that it's not about sort of arts of domination or resistance, but it's at least a way of sort of like taking the resources that we have and shifting them around a little bit to the extent possible. And I think that extent is actually like a lot bigger, depending on what kinds of work we choose to value and validate within the community that we belong to.
We do need to vacate, but I want to say just two things before I thank the panelists for an incredible set of presentations. The first is that oftentimes when we think about domination, and I think that the panelists today have gotten us to think about so many issues, but one is that domination oftentimes atomizes. And in a way, what they're highlighting is not only the atomization that happens with domination, but also how art, whether or not it's physical or textual or cinematic or what have you, provides a space for people to come together and to reflect, not only on the dominations that they're experiencing that they might think are atomized, but to go back to those systemic dynamics. And this, in turn, made me think about Paulo Freire, his long, older work about pedagogy of the oppressed, which is oftentimes you don't see the domination as systemic until you start to come together in collective ways. Sometimes in those conversations, to come back to the binary, you might think that resistance is just flipping who's on top, but actually it's the imagination and coming together to rethink how you would deal with that oppression in new ways. That is what makes it more radical, more revolutionary, more interesting, hopefully with a new vision. And in that, I just want to really applaud all of you for thinking about this not just as a study that we observe and write and portray, but to think about this in partnership, in solidarity, to go back to some of the words that were used, to think about the ethics that have been noted. At the end of the day, that's part of this enterprise, not just to write and to read for ourselves, but to open up that conversation for all. So I want to thank everyone for the year, for thinking about this existential challenges overall, and this panel in particular, for opening up so many conversations that I hope we continue. Warm welcome, warm applause. Thank you.